Well, where I come from, when you see a snake, you kill it. You don't appoint a committee on snakes. In war, indecision is the worst thing. He said, you've got a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk who are like not the nicest guys, or at least, don't come across that way. But boy, do they execute.
What a great conversation we had today. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by Steven Kaplan. He's professor at Chicago Booth University. And we talk a lot about his study looking at very detailed data on attributes that make a CEO successful. And spoiler alert, it is just one thing and one thing only. We share experiences on what makes a good CEO successful, choosing the right CEO, and trapped boards and the CEOs themselves fall into when they are planning CEO succession. Enjoy this episode. So I'm very pleased to welcome Steve to the show. Good morning, Steve. How are you today?
I'm very good, Joe. Sunny
Chicago. I'd love you to give a bit of an intro to our listeners. Tell us a bit about yourself.
So I am a professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. I've been there a long time. I also run our entrepreneurship center, and I do research on things like private equity, venture capital, and CEOs, which we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I'm excited about talking about CEOs today. So you published a paper in 2021 talking about how CEOs have changed. Can you give us an overview? I mean, how have CEOs changed? Talk us through some of the headlines from that study.
So I'm going to, pull back. I should add to my introduction, I've been on boards of like 5 public companies. So I have some practical experience. I'm an LP in a bunch of private equity funds. So I sort of try to bridge my academic and practical kind of activities. So my CEO work, I started many, many years ago doing work on CEOs with data from a firm called GH Smart. And GH Smart is super interesting because they assess C-level candidates for companies. They started out in private equity and venture, assessing candidates for private equity firms, venture capital firms, for the portfolio companies. And then they were successful. They now do it for public companies, private companies. It's sort of very broad. So I have very good data from GH Smart over the years on CEO assessments. And so I started doing this probably 2010-ish, and have worked with it since. And after, working with it for some time, the paper you're referring to, we had data on C-level candidates, including CEOs, from like 2001 to 2019. So it was a really long data set. And we had like 5,000 assessments in that data. I think over 1,000 of which were for CEO candidates. And so what we could do is we could look at how those CEO candidates and other candidates were assessed over time, and then to see whether it changed. And what was interesting about that is, you sort of read, oh, the CEOs have to be different now. They have to, millennials are different. And so what we did in that paper is we divided up the sample basically before the great financial crisis, which would have been, the 2001 to 2008. And then after the great financial crisis, which was sort of half, 50-50 in the sample. And to see whether, and we also looked at trends, year by year, to see whether the CEOs changed. And it turned out that the CEOs who are hired, it's kind of the same. That you don't see this view that you have to be nice, or you have to be this, you have to be that. It's just not in the data.
So that tells us then, well, that's a short podcast episode then. So have CEOs changed?
No, there's a lot more to talk about. Well, then you want to know what they're like, right? Which
tell me some of the attributes, what's changed in some of the detail,
and what's in the data, and what you find and all this stuff. So the thing that is in the GH Smart assessments, and if anyone's, probably some people listening have gone through it. If you haven't gone through it, you have to understand what it is that, whether it's the board or the private equity investor or whoever will say, look, I want to interview you. And so the person from GH Smart goes to the candidate and basically does a 4 or 5 hour interview. So this is grueling. It's not like a half an hour, you meet someone in the office, you interview him or her, and you don't learn anything. This is like something where they really dig into the person. They ask very specific questions about their life and their career, who they worked for, what their people would say. They also give follow up with where the company does with reference checks to confirm what you're saying. And so by the end of this 4 or 5 hour interview, it's very hard to BS for 4 hours.
Yeah.
In a half an hour, you can sort of hide stuff. 4 or 5 hours
Mhm.
is very, very hard. And people who've gone through it will say, I felt naked when I was over. I felt like it was a medical exam or, proctology exam, some people say. And so you get actually quite accurate information or interesting information. And then they rate the candidates on 30 different dimensions. So, is the person strategic? Is the person a good team player? Is the person a good listener? And so on and so forth. So it's 30 attributes that, kind of capture the various things you think you'd want in a CEO. And so what we've done over the years is then take those 30 ratings and see what's in them. And so
Okay.
when you take those 30 ratings and you sort of look at them statistically, you get four factors that explain actually more than half the variation in those 30 variables. So, and what they are is, it turns out that, one thing you want to look at is just sort of the sum of all those ratings. So call that your talent. Like, you just add up all the ratings, they tend to be correlated, and we'll call that talent. And that explains, variation. Then the second one, which is super interesting, I think the most interesting, is that this variable weights positively attributes that look like being a good team player, being personable, being likable. And this thing like being a good listener, being a good team player, being calm. And then the flip side of that factor is what looks like execution, like, being fast, being efficient, being proactive. And the scores on those explain a lot of variation. Some people, are strong on execution. Some people are strong on being personable or team players. And but they, are negatively correlated. Some people load here, some people load there, and explains a lot of variation. The third factor looks like something like charisma. And then the fourth factor looks like something like creative strategic. It weights heavily on variables like, is creative, is smart, variables like that. So you've got those four factors, and then you can see how the CEO candidates, what they look like, the CFO candidates, all the different candidates, how they map on these four factors. And here's what we find: talent, the CEOs tend to be more talented, which you would expect.
Yeah.
Charisma, the CEOs tend to be more charismatic. And interestingly, the CFOs are very uncharismatic. It's exactly
Which is the stereotype predicts, isn't it,
and
really?
actually the chief sales officers are like off the charts on this charismatic thing, which is, they're sales guys. The creative strategic CEOs score highly. Now, the one that's interesting, and I always ask audiences, where do the CEO candidates load on execution versus interpersonal? And when I ask people that, it's like 50-50. Some people
Mm.
say, oh, they're interpersonal team players. Some people it's execution. It turns out the CEO candidates are execution. And so those are the candidates and what they look like. Now, if you look at then from the candidate who gets hired, those relationships all hold. And this is relative to the other C-level candidates. But what moves a little bit is the interpersonal. So
Mm.
the CEO candidates are very strong on execution. The ones who are hired are strong on execution, but a little less so. I mean, it moves toward they take the people who execute and then they seem to hire the one they like, right?
Yeah.
And talent goes up a little, charisma goes up a little, creative, strategic doesn't move. So that's sort of that's who gets hired. So if you're looking for advice, people say, so what does that mean for me? If you're, someone who wants to be a CEO, what I say is make sure you execute, right? You should be creative, strategic. You should try to be a little more charismatic, and that means being persuasive, being proactive, and you can probably work on that a little. And then the execution, it's like make decisions, get stuff done. And but then once you're a candidate, you have to make sure they like you. So it's sort of like but it's very much, if you want to be a candidate, those are the variables that matter. And then what I did in the first paper where we looked at this and we had good data. And then I'll tell you another thing I worked on that's relevant. The the thing that we then looked at is, okay, who succeeds? Which of these variables matter? And it turns out more talented people tend to be more successful. The more creative, strategic tend to be more successful. So again, now board members who are listening, that's relevant. And then again, let's look at the execution versus interpersonal.
Mm-hmm.
It's execution. The
Right.
interpersonal variables were irrelevant, and they weren't negative, but they weren't positive. They were irrelevant. It was execution. And so again, for someone who wants to be a CEO, like, execute. And then if you're a board member, and you see that, you can see this sometimes when you read articles about CEOs who didn't work out. A lot of those cases, they hired the person who's kind of likable, but didn't execute. I mean, Jeff Immelt would be my favorite example of that. That he, the three candidates, he was the one who was kind of the most likable and interpersonal, but he didn't. I mean, when you read about what he did at GE, completely ignored execution.
Okay.
And I'm not sure how creative, strategic he was. And then a year or two ago, one of the big search firms asked us and I've done this work with Morton Sorensen, who's at the Tuck School at Dartmouth. A big, search firm asked us to take a look. They had assessment data of about 200 people they'd placed as CEOs, about half of which were public companies. So this was a more public company sample than the GH Smart one we'd worked with. And we took the assessments. We said, okay, what are they like? We characterized them. And then and these were Hogan and OPQ type assessments. And then again, we looked at the performance of the companies and mapped them. And it turned out, very similar results. The people who were execution oriented did much better than the people who were not execution oriented, or kind of the more, I don't want to say likable, but they cared more about being liked. So anyway, I'll stop there. That sort of gives you a sense of what we found. And so I have very strong views of what you could look for when you hire someone
Well, I mean,
else.
it's super clear, isn't it? Right? It's execution, execution, execution. That's it. It's that you put those that you hire for that more than anything else. But what's interesting
And
about
being able to be strategic, right? I think those are, that
the
helps.
two there?
Yeah.
And does it weigh? Which way does it go? Is it much more on the execution, or is it strategic, or you need a mixture of both of them?
They're
Which
both
one is the more?
important.
They're both important because they're both.
I mean, the way the variables are
Yeah.
created, they're uncorrelated. So that's the nice
Okay.
thing about them. And so they're two separate things. So if you get both, that's great. I think the one where you do get the failure and this is in the search firm data, it was the execution variable. If you don't have the people who didn't execute, their success rate was like almost zero.
Almost zero. All right. So it's a really strong, clear message there, in that execution is the key. So if you're hiring for a CEO at any level, that's the skill set you're looking for, is somebody who is proven in execution, has the ability to be able to do that and to lead in terms of executing on strategy, in terms of that stuff. That's
Right.
the clear part of it. And then the second element of that is their ability with that vision setting to understand what they need to do and what they need to execute on, and not having a
Correct.
blind spot there. So again, of course, if you don't know what to do, you can't execute on it. in that same way.
I believe that is correct.
Yeah. And that, do you know, that does resonate very strongly with the people that I work with. So I work with a lot of founders, and founders often, when you speak to them, and any assessments they do, and I do assessments with the folks I work with, they score really very highly on creativity and visionary elements to it. And what always fails in terms of any startup is again back to execution. Is they make mistakes in terms of execution. They don't know when to change track or change approach, and they fail to hire folks who are excellent in execution. So again, message is very clear. If you're a visionary, strategic founder and owner of a business, you need to hire people around you who are heavily execution focused to be able to support you in terms of that vision.
And I think also you want to make sure to make decisions. I think some people, there's analysis paralysis, so they don't make decisions. I think that that's one error. I think the other thing that I think is consistent with this is there are some people who just want to be liked.
Yeah.
And that's where, yeah, that's where the interpersonal comes in. Yeah, you're a team player, you're a good listener. But you don't, you're sort of conflict averse. So you won't make a tough decision, which is, maybe firing somebody, maybe, doing something that, half the people won't like, but half the people will, and it's the right decision, but you postpone it. And so I think that also plays into the people who execute. It's, you execute. There's a great quote from Ulysses S. Grant, actually, who's the person who won the Civil War for the United States. And he says, in war, indecision is the worst thing. He said, we do something, we'll find out quickly whether it's the right thing or not. If it's the wrong thing, I'll do something else. But like the worst thing is not to decide. And of course, he took over in the Civil War from generals who wouldn't do anything. And he actually did stuff and,
I love that quote. Yeah, that matches really, again, very similar to a lot of the things that I see with. There's a great piece of work by Patrick Lencioni, which is the 5 Temptations of a CEO. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
Right.
And he talks about all of those. And most of those are, putting ego over results, harmony over making decisions. And it all comes back to that idea that if you want to be liked, you put yourself ahead of the work that needs to be done, you're not going to be successful. And that's echoed again back in the work that you've done around execution being much more important. In filtering out those leaders who sort of put their own ego ahead of the results that they're going to get, it means that they don't execute quickly, they don't do the right things, they put harmony over results, they don't get the work done that needs to be done. And those folks who focus on execution first, they don't worry about those things so much to get things done and are ultimately more successful.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to hear. It's interesting that we're, to hear the academic side of it from you and to match that to some of the interesting things that I'm seeing with a lot of my leaders. That, yeah, you're right. Decision paralysis is the killer of especially many of the early stage startups that I work with. That's the end for them. If they're not moving, they're not making decisions quick enough, they're not going to move, not going to survive in quite the same way. If you're a larger organization, you can take quite a few years of indecision and paralysis. And we've seen those organizations who take a long time to slowly fade away versus, and that again, typically seems down to the people who aren't able to make decisions. I mean, you mentioned GE there. Can you talk us through that then with that particular example there?
If you read what Immelt did after Welch, and Welch wasn't perfect. He was, he had, pluses and minuses, and people criticized him going to financial services. But boy, he moved quickly. Boy, he made decisions, and he really improved GE from like 1980 to, the mid 90s. And then when Immelt took over, you read his book, he was, Joe Nocera wrote an article about him early in his tenure saying that Immelt was the new kind of CEO. He was a good listener. He was a nice guy. He was, sort of a modern CEO. And when you read Immelt's book, it's like amazing. There were certain things. He said one point in his book, he said, I knew I should have done X, but my board would have given me a hard time, so I didn't do it. And it's like, are you kidding? And he wrote that. It's like, so, and he was not into the details. He was not, his strategic sense was not strong. So he sort of was not great on either the strategy or on execution. And, you see what happened.
But the board liked him, I'm guessing, as well, right? He was probably popular amongst the board, and he had that element that probably kept him in that role longer than he should have been.
I suspect that's true.
Yeah, so
And there's another, another on the flip side, there's a very funny story. I think Ross Perot, who was started EDS, he sold it to General Motors and became a billionaire. This was in the early 80s. And when he sold the business to General Motors, they put him on the board. And at that point, it's hard to believe General Motors was probably the most prominent US company, maybe along with IBM, and being on the board was a big deal. And 2 years later, he resigns. And it's front page news of the Wall Street Journal. Ross Perot resigns from the GM board. And they ask him, why'd you resign? And he goes, forgive my Texas accent. He goes, well, where I come from, when you see a snake, you kill it. You don't appoint a committee on snakes. And just like
I love that quote. Execution again. But what's interesting about this is where we're going is you think what you need in terms of these large businesses is a heavy focus on strategy, that the organization itself should be strong at execution. So the CEO sits at the top and says, like any sort of general word, we need to go and take that hill over there. Where is this? Does that mean that maybe in the short term or over a few cycles that this execution element is successful in terms of, shareholder value, whatever we want to describe that, but longer term strategic initiatives are not prioritized? Does that mean there's a lacking in terms of strategic thinking at the top when there's heavily focused on execution? Is that a danger for the future?
I think you clearly right. You need to have the right strategy and you need to execute. I think, what you see in at least the data I've looked at, if you don't have the execution, forget it. Right. That's and you can see that in looking at a person's history. And I think doing these assessments. So I highly recommend, when boards make these decisions, or someone who is a serious assessment person. I have a couple of my private equity friends who are running private equity firms. One in particular says he will not make an investment unless the CEO goes through this assessment, because he finds that the assessments are extremely good at finding the people who aren't going to succeed. So I think you need that. That's the mistake people make. They ignore the execution part. Once you have execution, then, some people get the strategy right. Some people won't. So it's not and if you just execute without thinking of the strategy, you can go awry. So it's not perfect, but it's like, if you don't have it, forget it. Once you have it, then you have a chance, and you can avoid like being in the lower tail by thinking about this.
Yeah. It's very good advice, because you're right. If you come through an interview process, that's going to be heavily biased towards the charismatic interpersonal skills elements that you mentioned earlier on, which are important, but general interviewing favors those skills. We know that research is always
for sure. And you can look at look at some of the great CEOs out there that are, consistent with this. So you've got a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk, who are like not the nicest guys, or at least, don't come across that way, but boy, do they execute. Steve Jobs was like that. But then you can have people who do have the interpersonal skills and execute as well, like Satya Nadella, who by the way was a student of mine. So I'll say I didn't screw that up. You read his autobiography, and he's clearly actually a nice guy, or interpersonally cares about people. But he says, what are my management recommendations? Like, be clear and get stuff done, basically. And Bob Iger, the same. Bob Iger, who's like a very, likable guy, did a great job at Disney, said early in his career, what he was known for is that if you needed to get something done, I would get it done. And so again, both of these are people who actually would score quite high on the interpersonal, but boy, do they execute.
Yeah. Okay. Back to that same message again, execution, execution, execution. That's king. So how does that map into succession then within an organization? Because often if there's a dramatic exit of a CEO, the board then, they're in a position to replace the CEO, right? They are at the head of that process. But often, typically, what can happen in these larger organizations is the CEO themselves, is responsible for the succession planning of the next person coming along. And how should that factor into this as well? Can you talk about succession planning if you're a sitting CEO?
So I think it's a similar, you know, kind of decision and a similar set of risks that you hire the person you like and you maybe, don't get the execution thing. And it may be that if you were a really successful CEO who executed, may be hard to figure out that the person who was your number two or number three was riding on your coattails, and it's not clear that he or she can do the same thing. So you might say GE, that was true. ML, was
Mm.
the one that Welch liked, and Welch was so good at executing that you couldn't tell necessarily what was going on there. I know another story of a Fortune 50 company where an extremely successful CEO did the same thing. He brought in, the sales guy who was likable, and the guy, basically, managed by PowerPoint, didn't make decisions, and he was gone within 2 years. So I think that it's the same thing to watch out for. I think if you're a board, I mean, you have to be part of the process. And the thing that also I think is in data. So I've got some other papers where I look at where so let's compare S&P 500 companies or public
Hmm.
companies to private equity funded companies. There's a really super interesting result that the S&P 500 companies historically, like 75% of their CEOs are insiders. 75. And the private equity funded companies, when they bring in a new CEO, 25% are
Wow.
insiders. It's like the opposite. And
Yeah.
so what the private equity funded companies are willing to do is they're willing to go outside and I think look for the best CEO talent. And then when you ask those CEOs whether, what matters, is it, management skills? Is it industry skills? Is it company specific skills? The external ones say that management skills are number one. Actually, the internal CEOs say management skills are number one. The external ones then say industry skills are number two. And actually, the internal ones say industry is number two. Then the external ones say company specific skills are irrelevant. The internal people say company specific skills are important.
Yes.
But sort of not. They're about the same as industry and less than management skills. So their rankings are the same. It's just that the internal people think the company specific is more important. But the fact is, the external ones say it doesn't matter. It's industry and managerial,
Management first.
and that's how the private equity investors do it. They're very happy to bring in people who have strong industry skills, strong management skills, and those people are, clearly can be successful. So if I'm a board and I don't have that really good internal candidate, look externally. The problem is I think it's more work for a board.
Well, it's more of a risk as well, isn't it? I see that too. It's always felt a little safer if we go with a known person who is, let's be honest, more often than not, the CFO gets
Yeah, maybe it may
as
be
well, right? There's
safer.
a safety there.
Well, if the
Well,
person
these are
can't
known
execute,
for,
I would say if the person can't execute, it's not
oh,
very
hey,
safe.
Steve, I'm totally with you. I'm the same way. But what you see is there's a level of safety with PLC that's different from
Oh yeah, yeah, of
private
course.
equity, right?
No, because
Private
you know the
equity
person.
want growth. Yeah, they're looking for that growth more. As PLCs, if you ask them what's most important to you, it's often stability at the end of the day is really what they want. They'll say they want growth, but they'll often prioritize stability over that. for
Mhm.
me behind the back. So the numbers don't surprise me. I mean, I'm surprised about how stark it is, the difference between insiders versus outsiders, and how you can certainly see from a private equity point of view why bringing an outsider in can really help you kickstart things as well in terms of that different approach. Again, especially if they're great executors as well. So yeah, really interesting that number and that
Mhm.
approach. Yeah. And so, what advice would you give to PLCs then in terms of this of hiring when it comes to succession? Is it to go broad in terms of who you look at? What's the sort of what's your advice around that?
I think, for if you have an internal candidate who checks the boxes we talked about, then that's great. And I think, that's the argument why the larger companies maybe do more internal people, that you've got more of a talent pool. And so if you have, internal talent and you have somebody who's really good, then that's great. I think if you don't or you're not sure, then cast a wide net.
Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Well, we're pretty much out of time. Thank you for your time today, Steve. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, you're very welcome. I did too.
So, where can people find out a little bit more about you? Where can people go?
Just Google me. My website is easy to find, and that's probably the best way.
Yeah. And can you leave our listeners with a sort of final thought for looking and CEO succession and hiring? What would be your final recommendation or thought?
I mean, the final thought is make sure you hire somebody who executes, and
Do you know what? I knew you were going to say that. But yeah.
avoid the person who is likable and maybe has an okay track record, but is slow and doesn't execute.
Yeah. I think what's interesting, what I've taken away from what you said as well is also is spread that net wider if you're in a larger business. Don't assume that next person is going to be groomed from inside to be the next logical person to take over. And then if you're a CEO, you may be slightly blind to their ability to execute, especially if you're an executor. They may be, as you put it, on your shirt tails there to a certain extent, taking charge of that. And they may compliment you in that they are quite charismatic or likable. And that might, be a useful asset to you to have, but they may not be a natural successor for you as well. I think that's definitely something, a trap
That's
to
a good
avoid.
point. That's a good
Yeah.
point.
All right. Thanks again for your time, Steve.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.